Thanks for clicking. Canada's inflation rate for the month of April came in hotter than expected this morning, with economists expecting a 1.6% increase and the actual data coming in slightly hotter at 1.7%. And while that was a minor increase and many are still expecting the Bank of Canada to cut rates, as we'll see today, measures of core inflation, those measures which the Bank of Canada cares about when deciding whether or not to lower or raise interest rates, came in much hotter than the bank would like to see. And today's reports come as we're getting multiple conflicting reports as to the level of inflation that Canada can expect to see as this trade war drags on. With Oxford Economics noting that recent exemptions to Canada's counter tariffs have dropped the effective tariff rate to nearly zero, whereas Loblaws is warning about price increases across its stores over the next couple of weeks. Fast forward, and over the weekend, Canada's finance minister responded back to that Oxford report on Twitter, noting that Canada has paused some tariffs, but 70% of them are still in place.
Everything that guy just says is bullshit. Thank you.
So what I want to do today is go over Canada's inflation data for the month of April, take a look at the conflicting reports as to how much counter tariffs are really in place, and then discuss some implications for interest rates and the Bank of Canada. Speaking of the central bank, the Bank of Canada's next interest rate announcement is in just 2 weeks' time, with a press conference to be held thereafter, and we will obviously have an update out on both on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, let's get into this inflation data. Onto inflation. As mentioned, Canada's inflation rate came in at 1.7% in April, brought down in large part, as alluded to by the masters of the obvious in the media, the removal of the consumer carbon tax. Major month-over-month upward contributors to the inflation rate included financial services, cars, rent, travel, and meat, the discretionaries, whereas gas, natural gas, fuel, digital media, and other fuel pushed the inflation rate down. So, because we had the carbon tax last year, but now we don't, those year-over-year numbers show an inflation rate far below 2%.
We're all clear.
With that said, measures of core inflation, the measures the Bank of Canada cares about when deciding whether or not to raise or lower interest rates, showed continual upward movement, with core median coming in at 3.2, up from 2.8, and core trim coming in at 3.1, up from 2.9. Further, that's just the year-over-year. If we look at the month-over-month measurements, we see continual heating up of inflation as well, something that will, over the next few months, start to show up in those year-over-year numbers. So, inflation coming in below 2%, coming in at 1.7, a bit hotter than that which was expected. Core inflation coming in much, much hotter than the Bank of Canada wants to see. But Tony Stilo of Oxford Economics says that the inflation stemming from the counter tariffs may not be as high as many had been anticipating, as with the exemptions to the counter tariffs, those tariffs are now effectively at zero. If you'll remember last month, Prime Minister Mark Carney offered up some pretty big exemptions to Canada's counter tariffs, including a 6-month reprieve on those items that are used in Canadian manufacturing, processing, food and beverage packaging, public health and national security. As well, if you'll remember again, if you manufacture cars in Canada, you're also allowed to import foreign cars to Canada tariff-free.
But I'm still mad at you. So mad. So disappointed.
And yeah, to a certain extent, it does sound a bit like Munich, a bit like appeasing an aggressor, which was reiterated by Tony Stilo, noting that with tariffs going to nearly zero, it's a strategic play on the government's part not to damage the Canadian economy. Stilo says that this was a very deliberate approach on the part of the Prime Minister to not have retaliation. And yeah, not at all saying that I agree with the strategy, but the analysis does make sense. We saw what happened when China retaliated and a continual amping up with a tit for tat between the Grand Master and Beijing, pushing tariffs up to 145%. So Stilo is noting that the Prime Minister could be trying to avoid this type of Grand Mastery one-upmanship.
500!
So, it looks at least from these reports that the things that are being targeted in the counter tariffs aren't the stuff that's going to lead to widespread inflationary pressures throughout the economy. Food, clothing, cosmetics, probably not likely to lead to widespread inflation brought on by a wage price spiral. But this obviously does not look that great for a Prime Minister that campaigned on elbows up, with Finance Minister Francis Philippe Champagne, after initially refusing to comment, tweeting back that 70% of tariffs were still in place. Which leads to the obvious question, which one is lying? What does the report actually say? Well, first off, this report isn't so much a report as it is a webinar, something that none of the articles that discussed this report alluded to, nor do any of these articles give a link to this report, not the National Post, not Bloomberg, not the Toronto Sun, not Wealth Professional, etc. Given that Canadian media, as we've seen multiple times on this channel, has shown itself to be barely literate on a good day, and complicit hacks serving their masters in the real estate industry on a normal day, cite the things that you source so we can verify your credibility, if you actually read it and watched the webinar, which I suspect you didn't. Seriously, look at this junk that gets posted. Champagne says tariffs are still active. Canada says tariffs still remain. Both of the articles, all of the articles really, describe what exactly happened, none of which try to figure out why there is a discrepancy.
A journalist's credo.
Regardless though, if we take a look at the webinar, link in the description, we can see where Oxford is getting its stats, noting that with the tariffs on autos being paused and 97% of what was on manufacturing being paused, we're basically at a 6-month pause on the counter tariffs. So what Oxford did was take a look at the list of Canadian tariff product codes at the detailed 3 and 4 digit level and mapped them to industry categories. They then analyzed which of these product codes were linked to the manufacturing sector that got the 6-month reprieve to find out exactly how many products were on pause. And Oxford elaborated on this during the webinar.
Now, what we've done is we've actually mapped the product codes of the Canadian counter tariffs into NAICS industries. And so we have that down all the way to the 3 to 4 digit level for the manufacturing sector. And what we found is that essentially about 97% of that additional 60 billion in Canadian counter tariffs are related to manufacturing.
So it does look like Oxford has done its homework, though I would prefer that it made that data set public in demonstrating how those manufacturing exemptions leads to a near 100% pauses on tariffs. But as mentioned, those exemptions do not cover finished products like food, alcohol, coffee, etc. And as such, we can have those 97% of exemptions and still see price increases at Loblaws and Walmart. So on the one hand, we've got Oxford Economics that's described its methodology, said how it's gone through all of the industries, all of the product codes, matched them up to the counter tariff exemptions and came up with its numbers. And then on the other hand, we have the government that has said, nah.
You both make compelling points.
And if that is in fact the case, if Oxford is in fact correct, and although we don't have a data set, it does look like it's done its homework, then that would help to explain why, during the central bank's last announcement, the Bank of Canada said it only expects inflation to hit 3.1% by 2026, a point which, coincidentally or not, is matched by the projection made by Oxford Economics in its webinar, which also predicts a near 3% inflation in 26. My guess is if Oxford Economics and the central bank have access to the same data, and the Bank of Canada is making the same conclusions based off that underlying data, then chances are Oxford Economics' conclusions and its data are probably correct. And on that point, media, now that you know this report actually exists in webinar form, again, link in the description, maybe use your finite access to the Bank of Canada governor at the next press conference to ask about that correlation. Did the Bank of Canada include those massive tariff exemptions? Does it agree with that 97% projection made by Oxford Economics when it's making its inflation projections?
Do you like pie?
But yeah, I think if Oxford Economics is correct that the majority of those counter tariffs are gone, then that does leave, at least at its face, the Bank of Canada some room to cut interest rates to save the economy, which Oxford expects will see a loss of 120,000 jobs over the next year. If inflation is just going to show up in these finished goods, if it's just going to show up in, say, food, alcohol, coffee, orange juice, fruit, veggies, etc., then the central bank can and will say that interest rate policy cannot affect food prices, and as such, we can lower interest rates to help save the economy. This is completely disconnected from inflation. So, on the one hand, today we have April's inflation coming in much hotter than expected. On the other hand, we see Oxford Economics giving us a detailed webinar, a detailed report, arguing that inflation isn't going to be as bad as many had predicted. With the countermeasures removing the majority of price increases that Canadians could have seen, the upward pressure on prices won't be nearly as bad. As to whether or not these exemptions were the correct move on the part of the Prime Minister, I'll leave that to the Grand Masters of Global Strategy. both elected and not.
And so here's what is going to happen.
But if that is in fact the case, then we do have a central bank more able, again, at least on its face, apt to cut interest rates to help save the economy. We will obviously continue to track how all of these policies actually play out in the economy on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, thanks so much for watching.